What is the language of love between a Palo Alto firewall that wants to talk to an Active Directory server so that we can leverage the user accounts and the settings that are already in Active Directory? The answer, my friend, is Ldap. Microsoft's Active Directory is probably corporate America's most popular method for storing information about users, their accounts, what they're able to do, and to control access inside of a private infrastructure. And one of the thoughts is, if you can't beat them, join them. For example, if we have 5,000 users already defined in Active Directory, we can train the Palo Alto to go ahead and use that information along with the logs in Active Directory, including security logs, so that the Palo Alto can associate an IP address, for example, 10.1.1.25, with Bob the user. And that feature in the Palo Alto world is referred to as user ID. And the cool thing about user ID is that we can then associate policies based on users. So if we want Bob the user or certain groups in our company to have certain rights or privileges or access, with the Palo Alto being able to tie into Active Directory and look at that information regarding who is who and what IP address they're using, that's also going to help our logs so we can see what happened and who did it. So instead of just seeing an IP address, we can also see the user ID behind that IP address. So one of the first steps into using user ID and getting access to Active Directory is to create a profile for Ldap. Ldap is an acronym for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. And Windows servers support Ldap access. So we're going to tie into Active Directory via Ldap. We can also create an authentication profile that will leverage the Ldap database, the Active Directory that we already have in place. So in order to tie into Active Directory, we pretty much need three things. First of all, we need to have an Active Directory server that's running and supporting Ldap services. Secondly, we're going to create an Ldap server profile, which tells the Palo Alto firewall how to reach and how to communicate with that Ldap service running on our Windows server. And then we can create an authentication profile that will allow our Palo Alto firewall to use the Ldap server during the authentication process to verify that, for example, Bob really is Bob. And that'll be useful for some additional features coming up, including virtual private networks or any other time that we need to make a user prove who they are. So in this nugget, I'd like to walk you through setting up both of these items, an Ldap server profile and an authentication profile. I also, just as a prerequisite to this, I've also got an Active Directory server, and let me draw them over here. I've got an Active Directory server. His IP address, or her IP address, is .111 on this 192.168.1 subnet, which we are also using as our management network. So here in the graphical user interface, we're going to go to the Device tab up here on the top right. And on the left-hand side, to set up an Ldap profile, we're going to go down to Server Profiles. We'll expand that tree there. And from the subsection here, we'll select Ldap. Now currently we don't have any Ldap server profiles, but we can create one by simply clicking on Add. And let's name this our Ldap profile. And in this profile we're going to add at least one Ldap server. So we'll click on Add, and let's call this AD1, and the actual IP address of that server is 192.168.1.111. And the port is 389. So that is for just plain Ldap. If we're using SSL, the port would be 636. So I'm going to leave it at the default of 389. I'm also going to remove this check from this checkbox saying that SSL/TLS secured connection is required. Now, this is my lab. However, in a production environment, it's very likely we would want to use a secured connection between the Palo Alto firewall and the Ldap server. So regarding the server settings, from the drop-down, we'll select Active Directory. The base distinguished name, we'll go ahead and put DC equals nuglab, comma, DC equals local. And that is the top two levels of my Active Directory structure in my lab environment. And the bind distinguished name is referring to what user account do we want to use as we make these Ldap requests. And in a production environment, it's very likely we'd have a special account just for that purpose with basically just enough rights to do that job. However, because it's my lab, I'm going to go ahead and use administrator at nuglab.local, just like that. And the password is capital NUGGET exclamation mark 23. And that's the password I use in all of my labs. And I'll confirm that password. And then I'll click on OK. And then we'll go ahead and commit this by clicking on commit and confirming that. So how do we verify that this is actually working? And that's a pretty big step. We actually want to make sure that we can connect to and make queries from the actual Ldap services on our Active Directory server. And one way of verifying that we have good communications between the Palo Alto firewall and the Active Directory via Ldap is to go over to the left and select User Identification. So we'll click on User Identification. And then just for a moment, we're going to go to Group Mappings. Now we don't need to create a group mapping yet. For our purposes right now, I just want to verify that we can actually see the structure of Active Directory via Ldap. So to do that, we're going to click on Add, and we'll simply put in Test. And then for the server profile, from the drop-down, we'll select that one server profile, the Ldap profile that we just created a moment ago. So we'll select that. And then if we go to Group Include List, and we expand this tree, if it's showing us all of the containers and organizational units that are actually in our Active Directory, that's a great sign. So for example, here's our users container. And if we scroll down, we have all of our groups, including domain users and domain admins, and we could add one or more of them into the included groups. And our intention here is just to verify that we could query via Ldap over to the Ldap server. So I'm going to click on Cancel. I'm not going to create a group for right now. So now that we have an Ldap profile, the second thing I wanted to walk you through is creating an authentication profile. So over here on the left, so we're under Device, and on the left we're going to select Authentication Profile. We'll click on Add. We'll call this our authentication profile. For the type, we'll use the drop-down. We'll select Ldap. And then from the drop-down for server profile, we'll grab our Ldap profile. And then under the Advanced tab, we'll go ahead and click on Add. And I'm simply going to allow all. And then we'll click on OK. And then we'll commit those changes as well by clicking on Commit and then confirming it. So in this nugget, we've trained the Palo Alto firewall how to do Ldap requests and lookups against an Active Directory server. We've also set up an authentication profile that uses the Ldap profile. And these steps are part of the groundwork that we're doing in preparation for using the Active Directory accounts and groups for both user ID services and for authentication using Active Directory. So I'm glad you joined me for this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.